So before we left, we were talking about Confucius, how his teachings during a chaotic period in Chinese history were put down in a book known as the Analects. Analects, A-N-A-L-E-C-T-S. And how a few centuries after his death, that work would become a central tenet to Chinese political philosophy, and it would become important to Chinese life for 2,000 years to come. The next thing we're going to discuss is another Chinese faith, which was born around the same time as Confucius, called Taoism. Taoism was founded by an individual named Lao Tzu, Laozi. And like Confucius, he lived during the 6th century before the Common Era, 6th century BCE. Taoism is going to become an important Chinese religion, an important Chinese philosophy, but it's never really going to have that much influence over Chinese political life because the Taoist ideal doesn't stress political connectedness. Taoism is all about not being an active citizen and separating from political life and in many cases retreating from the society that you live in hopes of finding a balance in nature. And this is where this yin-yang symbol is derived from. It's a perfectly balanced symbol between the black and the white side. So it encourages disengagement from affairs of the world and the ability to try to live simple and live in harmony with nature. Taoism would also see some spread throughout China and into Southeast Asia and the Korean Peninsula, but it won't be as important politically speaking as Confucianism will be in China. On to Christianity. Emerging in the 1st century of the Common Era, in what is today Israel. At the time, it was a province of the Roman Empire. Founded by Jesus of Nazareth. Jesus was born Jewish. He was a Jewish teacher, ultimately. He led his life as a Jew. He was from a Jewish community. Okay? But ultimately, as he grew and as his teachings grew, he started to stray from the mainstream Jewish teaching. And his followers came to believe him as the Messiah that Jewish prophecy had told was going to come. He was seen as a threat by the Jewish leadership in Jerusalem. They called on the Roman governor to deal with Jesus. And ultimately he did. Here you guys have an image, a painting of the Roman governor of Judea, the Pontius Pilate, washing his hands of the decision to execute Jesus. Yes, ma'am.
Oh, I have a question.
Yeah.
Did you say Jesus was
A Messiah. Like essentially God coming to earth. So the Romans are going to convict Jesus and ultimately execute him. He was agitating the population. And remember, we talked the other day, the Romans care about keeping the peace and collecting taxes. And Jesus was making it hard to keep the peace because the Jewish priests in Jerusalem didn't want this guy around, didn't want Jesus around anymore. So he would ultimately be executed. Those followers of Christ believe that after Jesus' execution, he rose again from the dead, and then he ascended into heaven, and followers of Christ believe that Jesus is the Son of God and God at the same time, and we'll talk about this at a later date. Christianity is going to experience a pretty dramatic spread. Not at first, At first, it's going to be relatively local, but as time goes by, the religion will become more accepted by the Roman Empire that it was born within. By the 300s, by the 4th century, about 10% of the Roman Empire will be Christian.
By what year?
By 300. By 313, this is not a year you need to memorize at all, but the name you should be familiar with. By 313, Roman Emperor Constantine. Roman Emperor Constantine, that's where the city of Constantinople is going to get its name. We'll talk about that at a later date. Roman Emperor Constantine will issue the Edict of Milan, which will officially announce Roman toleration for Christians. So no more political persecution or government persecution of Christians can happen in the Roman Empire, according to the Edict of Milan. Eventually, before his death, Constantine converts himself to Christianity. And then every emperor after Constantine will become, or will be a Christian. So Christianity will rapidly spread then within the Roman Empire. And we see, because Roman Empire spread all the way around the Mediterranean up into modern-day France, and even hopping into Britain, it shouldn't be surprising to us that Christianity is going to be spreading throughout all these directions. Right? Someone take a guess as to why we don't see as strong of a Christian spread to the east. Like we mentioned, we saw some in India, but we don't see as strong of a Christian spread going into India or even further east into Asia. Yeah? Yeah, they had strong established religions in most of those areas. So where religion is already firmly entrenched and followed by people, it makes it that much more difficult for a new religion to come in and remove it. Questions, comments, concerns? Hannah?
Didn't Constantine convert himself after losing the battle and the cross?
Yes, yes.
And stuff, but he didn't like convert. He converted because of the permanent and now they were like believing it, I feel.
What's the difference?
He was like skeptic of it at first, but
Sure.
he said like Jesus, if you maybe for this battle, then I'll follow you. Like after he won the cross or whatever.
Sure. Yeah, so I guess people might have different ways to come to belief, but he was convinced that it was the way to follow. And then he started to, as he converts, now it becomes the state religion essentially, and it will grow from there as more will begin to follow. Again, where is the seat of the Roman Catholic Church? And the Catholic Church was really the original, at least in the Roman Empire, universal Catholic means, church in Rome. Where is the Roman Catholic Church based out of? Vatican City, which is in the middle of? Italy, in Rome, yeah. Adana? This is empire. This is during the empire. And we'll talk much more next week about the states and the government during these time periods. Okay, one last philosophy to talk about is going to be that of the Greeks and Romans. Romans before they convert to Christianity. So when we talk about Greco-Roman, we mean Greek and Roman philosophy. Their religion was polytheistic, and you guys have all seen enough Percy Jackson or read enough to know a little bit about mythology, Greek mythology. And the Romans essentially had the same mythology with just different names for most of the gods and goddesses, but same ideas behind them. The gods in Greek and Roman philosophy, the gods in their religion, were not always omnipresent and not always infallible, which means the gods screwed up, the gods sometimes messed with each other, the gods sometimes messed with people, according to the stories that people would tell. And so the gods were not perfect and the gods were not always all-powerful. What do you think that does for religion? Do you think that makes people follow the religion pretty strictly, or loose connections? Probably more loose connections, yeah. This is not the stories of omnipresent and all-powerful gods that do no wrong, like Christianity is going to teach, or like Islam is going to teach later. These are, for most Greeks and most Romans, loose connections to the faith. Okay, the religion is going to be used to help explain how the life we live on is working, but for most, it's not really a strong connection. Like we saw in India, or like we will see in India, with a polytheistic faith, you often don't have a lot of unifying culture within that. Okay? So in Greek society, for example, we don't talk about one Greek city or one Greek state. There's dozens of them, and they all have as their chief deity. They all have their own chief deities, right? This word pantheon, the prefix pan means all. So the Greek pantheon means all of the gods together. When we look at Greece, we also take note of their philosophical endeavors. The word philosophy is a Greek word, which means, anybody? What does philosophy mean? Love of thinking. Love of thinking. Like you guys are all sophomores right now. You see that same S-O-P-H in there. You know what your name means? Yeah, it means wise. But sophomore means like wise fool. Yeah, you guys aren't there yet. But you're getting there, right? So a love of wisdom. And Greece is probably most known for their line of great philosophers who thought about the world that they lived in, and they wrote about the world that they lived in, and in some cases wrote about the way the world they live in would be maybe better if they followed their teachings. Maybe a little bit more Confucius than religious side, right? Yes, ma'am?
Would like Socrates and Aristotle, would they all be like Confucius, like the Chinese people, how they...
Yeah, maybe similar. Sure. None of them are going to be like Confucius is far more important to Chinese culture than Socrates or Plato or Aristotle will be to Western culture. But along the same lines. So yeah, this is Socrates. He was a teacher, and you guys probably have all done a Socratic circle or engaged in the Socratic method where your teacher asks questions, or each of you ask questions of each other, probing for deeper understanding. All right? So the Socratic method gets its name from Socrates, because as a teacher, Socrates would just often confound his students by asking them more questions, with the idea that all understanding is actually within us. We just need to find it, and we need to get it out. Socrates had many students. One of his students that you guys have all heard of is named Plato, or was named Plato. Plato's most famous work is a book called The Republic, where he wrote about what he saw as the right way to rule a society, or a society should be run. Plato had a student of his own named Aristotle. You guys have probably heard the name Aristotle before. In addition to being a philosopher, Aristotle was also, a scientist, an observer of the world around him. Aristotle had his own student, a guy named Alexander the Great, just to put it to some connection that you guys have heard of. For my Quiz Bowl players, we always remember the SPA acronym, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, to remember their order. So in Greek culture, we get this emphasis on thinking, the human thinking, and humans working out the ways of the world, rather than spirituality, rather than worrying or concern about the afterlife or following some spiritual order. This is going to translate in Greece and then later in Rome to more attention being paid to the natural world around us, all right? And this is why, much of what you guys are even doing when you're working on geometry, for example, that had its origins in ancient Greece, and I'm sure you guys are thankful to them for that. We've got a very little bit left we're going to cover with this lecture, but we'll do that on another day. Any questions or comments or anything right now?